Hello, I'm the Angry Spork, and this is the 8th anniversary of Taking Issue, the comics review show you've never heard of, even if you've watched several episodes. Last season was another year of the crossover, with more unimaginable meetups, like the Ghostbusters trapping alien specters and being investigated by the lone gunman, Danger Girl visiting Gotham, then helping out G.I. Joe, and Martians attacking zombies and rock stars. Other crossovers were, well, a bit more expected when you think about it, like the Planet Express crew visiting Springfield, or the Heroes in a Half Shell meeting the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. Which really makes you curious about the differing team dynamics, when one group is all teenagers with attitude, while on the other side, only Raphael is cool but rude. It's also the season with my top 5 most viewed videos. 3 finally hitting quadruple digits, and 1 cracking 2K, so much appreciation for that, everyone who clicked. I know plenty of content creators manage that within hours of their uploads, but hey, be thankful in all circumstances. 1 Thessalonians 5:18 and all that. As with previous anniversary/season premiere episodes, I'm doing something other than a standard comic review, though it does kind of combine 2 concepts I've done in anniversaries past. One year I did a thought experiment about how a middling maxi-series post-New 52 could fit into a pre-reboot canon, and the year I turned into a cartoon, I reviewed an episode of The Simpsons. Now I rework a different episode of that show, one considered controversial for several reasons. The principal in the Pauper is about Seymour Skinner being revealed as not Seymour Skinner, actually an orphan turned street punk Armin Tamzarian. Skinner was his sergeant in the army who went missing, presumed dead, and the young soldier was so impacted by his mentorship, he assumed his identity. The real Seymour returned, took back his name and everything associated with it, while Armin left town, unable to live with his shame. Until being convinced to return, and since the townfolk just seem to prefer him out of apathy, the former POW is given the heave-ho, and the straight-laced principal gets his old assumed life back, made all legal because a judge said so.
Under penalty of torture.
Do you like how none of this is conveyed at all in the title card I made? See, 8 is the pottery anniversary, so I thought, why not have me trapped and sighed. The fireworks are nice, right? Whatever, moving on. This is considered by many fans, particularly those who have watched the show from the beginning, as the start of its decline. How eventually the entire premise was kind of invalidated, everything reverting to status quo so conveniently that it didn't seem to matter. Especially since the whole Armin thing is mentioned once a few years later, and years later after that is even contradicted.
This woman carried me for 9.5 months. I was out for 2 weeks, then went back in.
To say nothing of the episodes before Principal and the Pauper, where this guy is referred to as Skinner, and not even getting into the logistics of how the army wouldn't have been able to find him out. In fact, its events are basically considered non-canon, if a Simpsons wiki is to be believed. Some people behind the show have criticized it, like Skinner's voice actor Harry Shearer and series creator Matt Groening, yet there are those that just think it's great. I even saw one comment online once suggesting it was poking fun at such outlandish sitcom plots, but I'm not sure I agree. While I do feel the criticisms are valid and I don't think it's a terrible episode, I'm one of those crazy people that has an affinity for stable continuity, and I think if they're going to passively ignore it, why keep it at all? Speaking of... Now, with all respect to the episode's writer, Ken Keeler, could this episode work without the stolen identity angle? I think so, requiring just one notable change, which I'll get to shortly. So this version of the story would start off much like before. Springfield Elementary is celebrating Seymour Skinner's 20 years of service, and it's all slideshows and enjoyment buzzers until an old acquaintance arrives in his dress uniform. While the crowd is confused by all this, Skinner insists on his revelations being a bit more private. And the one big change that I'm talking about? Switch the names.
That man is Armin Tamzarian.
With that in mind, Seymour's youth was not that of a no-good Nick with no parents, but a young man that got sick of his mother's constant nagging, orders, scolding, and general unnecessarily cruel parenting. Maybe his dad, too, either being equally strict or just dismissive. He could just not be around at all. But in either case, Seymour would eventually run away, strike out on his own, going to Capital City. His petty crimes would be the same as with the events of him joining the army. It would be there he'd meet Sergeant Armin Tamzarian, an authority figure that wasn't quite as harsh as Seymour's parents. In order to connect with the young Seymour, he shares his dream of being an elementary school principal in Springfield, as they both happen to be from the same town, and gets the youngster to consider his own future, as well as the kind of camaraderie necessary in the armed forces. Skinner would take these firm yet more compassionate lessons to heart, and in the process began to see the value in what his parents were trying to teach him, even if imperfectly.
I kept screeching and screeching at him.
However, there has to be a reason for Seymour's guilt, so instead of living someone else's life, we could say that a bit of his rebellious nature lingered. The sergeant had intended on taking Seymour on a mission, but the young man lied, saying he wasn't really feeling well, and didn't end up going so he could get into some harmless shenanigans with some other soldiers at the base who were not part of said mission. When Armin went missing in action, Skinner blamed himself, thinking his recklessness had gotten someone he cared about killed. As penance, he became the kind of leader the sergeant was, achieving that very rank himself, kept the soldiers under his command in line, and after an honorable discharge not only chose to live out Armin's dream of being a school principal, but also became more adherent and tolerant of his mother's wishes well into his 40s, choosing to stay with her in order to make up for all the trouble he caused as a kid. The ever harshly critical Agnes, having always at least figured her son straightened out in the military, shows him even more contempt for this dishonor to the family name.
I have one stranger and one fraud.
After his big reveal, Seymour arranges for Tamzarian to crash at his house, taking his bedroom even though the sergeant says it's unnecessary, but his former pupil insists, which is why, coupled with being unable to face his mom, Skinner starts sleeping in his office. He does try to work through it all, live some form of his life, while actively avoiding Armin out of shame. But as well as Bart still gaslighting him to get out of punishment, people around Springfield are behaving a little differently around Seymour.
To me, you're just a stranger pretending to be something he's not.
Yeah, well, you have a gambling problem. It all becomes too much for Skinner, and he decides to leave town forever, after having Superintendent Chalmers hire Armin as principal.
Up yours, children.
He returns to Capital City, where he's failed to start fresh once, but maybe second time's the charm. While some in Springfield think this is a lateral move at first, Tamzarian begins to weigh on them, especially those close to Skinner, be it Agnes's hope of an improved replacement son being dashed, or misinterpreting Edna Krabappel's not-so-subtle cues.
You haven't dealt with women for a long time, have you, Sergeant?
Are you asking me out?
The chance encounter at the grocery store can remain largely unchanged, for both their discourse about their change in principles and whom they prefer.
12, 11, 10. The man's a weenie.
I am not a weenie! You are the weenie!
And Agnes's realization of what she lost. So the Simpsons and others take a trip to Capital City, track Seymour down, and he can still insist on staying in this ratty apartment. He was used to the kids not always listening to him, people often brushing him off as a tightwad, and even his mom's continued lecturing. But coming face to face with his greatest shame, and now Mrs. Skinner having a better son, he doesn't see the point in coming back.
You're my real son!
They reach him by saying he's done a lot of good for the community as an educator, a volunteer firefighter, as well as other civil services. He ran from his home as a teenager and ran from this secret since leaving the military. But regardless of his past mistakes, he's built a good life in Springfield, and he's strong enough to fight for it. Which would be better than the past couple decades of jokes, where the punchline is that he's basically a simpering man-child who doesn't know what's going on. Could we at least get a little more butt-kicking Skinner where appropriate?
You got an ex-Green Beret mad.
They make it back to town, where the people are hesitant to welcome him back, but he makes an impassioned apology, and that's when Armin Tamzarian approaches, who deserves the biggest apology of all. Seymour shouldn't have lied back in Nam just to meet some local girls with his buddies or whatever he was really doing, and the sergeant agrees, but admits he probably shouldn't have let him do that in the first place. Plot twist! Turns out, Armin knew the whole time that Skinner wasn't really sick, but given the fact that life is short enough outside the war zone that they were already in, he felt maybe his young charge could use some R&R, and really he mostly wanted him on that mission to keep an eye on him, but he didn't want to smother him as if he was too immature to make his own decisions, like his parents had done. If things had been different, if Tamzarian had called Skinner out on his ruse and taken him along anyway, maybe he could have avoided capture, or perhaps Skinner would have been captured as well, even joining him in that POW camp all these years, not being released until recently, or something worse could have happened to one or both of them. What's done is done. Seymour has become an upstanding citizen and pillar of the community and shouldn't have to shoulder the burden of his errors any further. Armin tells Seymour what he's been wanting to tell him since his return, that for all intents and purposes, he forgives him. Maybe there's a military statute that has something to say about all this, but it's not like the original episode went that far when it involved identity theft. It's just as well. While this is his hometown, Tamzarian figures it's changed as much as he has over the years, and he should start over somewhere else. He gets the impression that most people don't vibe with him very well, including Agnes. So maybe that's a good excuse to keep his departure via train. The episode could end on Seymour thanking everyone for their help, their understanding, and their forgiveness, and perhaps now he'll be more mindful of the local kid's misbehavior, loosen up a bit, and maybe stand up to his mother to be more of his own man.
Oh no, he won't.
Yes, Mother.
So that's how I think the principal and the pauper could have played out without such a big shakeup to the show's continuity. I know, sliding timescale as the show is halfway into its third decade, can't keep everything perfectly in line, I get that. But the Tamzarian thing wasn't really influenced by the passage of time. As stated before, the change it brought about has since been abandoned. I'd also like to think that regardless of whether or not we like or hate the premise, Ken Keeler still wrote a really funny script that's largely as solid as any other episode of its era. Its classic wit and comedy timing are still there, and it deserves some respect for that.
In your dreams.
We'll see about that.
It seems he was going for something that'd speak to the relationships and impact of one of the show's supporting characters, and while I think the episode largely achieves that, the alterations outlined in this video could do the same. Skinner made a choice in the army that comes back to haunt him. People who have known him and or respected him for years see him in a different light, even feeling betrayed, and he tries to leave his problems behind and start over, in a way behaving much as he did in his youth, though perhaps not immediately seeing those similarities. We'd get about the same amount of Armin, or the real Seymour Skinner, and people's feelings about him, but he'd leave on better terms. Mostly. What do you think? Was adhering to continuity a better choice, or did I manage to make things worse? Leave a comment while being respectful to the people who made that episode, and tune in next week where we get back to proper comic reviews, starting by finishing a short-lived ongoing series that we first looked at way back in Season 1, before I used clips, before I had theme music, and before I started regularly saying I'm the Angry Spork and man have I got issues.